So we see that the Indian at the Seichel breaks down the Rotzen into Chalokim. So how can you break a Rotzen into Chalokim, being as it is a Dover Achmi and a Dover Toikik, at a Gilui of the Achmi? So we could say in that the Indian of Rotzen, since, like we saw, it's the Gilui of what we call Chitonius. Not that it's Chitonius in its content, it's the Indian for your reader. Like we spoke Barikas in Pasha Vayero, the difference between Rotzen and Oinek. Oinek is the Indian of Aliyah of Dveikas Vishkal that's in the Etzem itself, and Rotzen is the Gilui Klape Chutz. Therefore, we can suggest that the Etzem makeup of Rotzen is that it's aiming at Inyonim B'chutz, B'poyo. Therefore, it's shayach to divide the Rotzen into Chalokim if the Inyan of the Seichel gains some sort of a say in the matter. Pirush, that the Seichel will come into a form of lavush on the Rotzen, albeit that's a willing act on part of the Rotzen Kaviyochel, that's come into Seichel. Therefore, since the Rotzen is aiming sof kosof at Inyonim b'poel mamish b'tui ho'ilo, and Seichel is a Inyan which is sof kosof also connected with the Metzias Ha'olam, that's what Seichel is about. And one of the Inyonim in Seichel is to show how things have different aspects to them and different interdivided sforas and different interdivided Inyonim. But that's what we see when our Inyan comes into Seichel. Then the Seichel breaks it down or divides it into different forms of reasoning and Svara, saying that if this is the case, then this we could suggest is the case. If that will be the case, then there'll be other interrelations of the Inyonim. That's what the whole Inyan from Seichel is. Ultimately, we're talking about pure Seichel, not Seichel how it is in the higher Madrigas of Chochmah, but Seichel how it is B'Golui. Therefore, Seichel tends to divide things and what you might call break them up into differing factors and differing sforas. Therefore, we could say that since Rotzen has entered the Inyan of Seichel and allowed it to become a lavush loy, in other words, that there's been a certain bittul on the part of the Rotzen to the Inyan of the Seichel, then that's the and Rotzen Ibechlal Sofa Inyan, which is aiming anyway at the Metzias of the world. Therefore, it's possible for the Seichel to literally put the details and Oifanim in the Gilui of the Rotzen. Dahainu, that the Seichel can say, good, what we ultimately want is, let's say, you want a house or you want to carry out a certain action, then if you reckon with a certain factor in reasoning and in understanding, then maybe you can somewhat, how do you call it, break down the Rotzen into different parts. And you'll say that instead of just wanting a house with all of its pomp and splendor, then first of all, let's say we'll want the foundations, and then we'll want the rooms. And Mamela will divide the Rotzen and we'll split it up, as it were. For the time being, the Rotzen is only going to be aimed at the Inyan of the, let's say, the foundations, or the first room, or the roof, or a chesed Inyanim of that nature. And Mamela, the whole tuike for the Rotzen, instead of being an intense Rotzen only for a house and only for a Inyan Kloli, V'achmi, it then becomes a reasoned will. That we want this and we want that, and in that gufa maybe there can occur what you might call certain nuances in the Rotzen. I wouldn't say alterations in the real sense, but certain abilities to reckon with difficulties. Somebody might say, well, look, that sort of roof just doesn't exist anymore, or the type of material that we had in mind for this and this, it's almost impossible to get nowadays, and it's very expensive. Maybe we can go, be Inyan Zeh, and if we do that, then that'll have a mile to give another Inyan, and therefore that'll have. And originally the Rotzen didn't know those Inyan, and it wasn't Beklal ready to reckon with that. validated the fact that the seichel became a lavush to the rotzen, so therefore the seichel can move into differing reckonings or sforas according to the dictations of the seichel, but ultimately it doesn't disturb the shleimus mitius of the rotzen. And that's why we suggested the pshat that the seichel, being in yonis sforas and interrelated ideas, then it's poil in the pshitas of the rotzen, also a reckoning with details and with differing possibility. Once it goes from seichel down into midas, base, a second lavush and a second hagbola, because midas compared to seichel are a lavush. Midas are malbishim seichel, as is well known, and there's further limitations in the union of midas, because once it comes into expressed emotion, then all the pratim and all the inyanim how they were in the seichel are not able to come into a midah, as is well known. That a mensch can't really bring into his final emotional feelings all the inyanim that he knew in the seichel, which presented or promoted or touched off in him that emotion. And as a famous expression has it, I can't get into feeling all that I knew in my mind. Everything I knew can't come into feeling. And then when it goes into later things, I can't really write everything, I can't express everything that I really feel. Each one is a yerida into a lavush, and that lavush involves a hagbola. And therefore the midas are called lavushim legabi de seichel. Now why would they be called lavushim? Because seichel deals with the emissar concepts and the inyonim how they are still al-choponim, connected with conceptual ideas and with interrelated inyanim, many of which are very delicate and high in their state. But when it comes into a feeling, into an emotion, so then emotion is connected with the feeling of the self, as is well known. Ahava, for example, is really, as it's called in certain places in Siddur, that Ahava is really who oheves atzmai, really the person loves himself. Because he loves himself, he has a certain desire to be makarev to himself, a certain inyan, and that's called ahava. That doesn't express or bring into gilu all the inyanim how they were in seichel, because in the inyanim of seichel he sees it in a much more detached and realistic way. Once he gets into a midah, and he's his matzias is much more involved in the middle than what it is in the reasoning. Therefore, the whole reasoning undergoes limitations, and the midas are malbish of that reasoning, and they make it go in a certain direction which will be for the teva of the Adam himself, rather than for the amitius adora kamoishahu. And that's the difference. That's the lavush of midas. But the lavush of midas is really a heavier lavush than the lavush of seichel, the gabi derot. Umi midas lamachshava, umi machshava ledibur. So once we complete the gila in midas, and we've completed the gila, what we call the eser koiches of the nefesh, because the eser koiches are midas and seichel, or seichel and midas, and then we move into what's called the lavushim. So the first lavush is what we call machshava, and you don't think unless you first of all have an arousal in the midas. What you're emotionally prompted or prodded to, well, that's what you think about, and then that enters the field, as the Alter Rebbe points in Tanya and Perek Kof. Then it enters what we call oisias. You also come into a whole realm in machshava of letters and oisias. Or mi machshava ledibur. In oisias themselves, there's a further big descent from the oisias of machshava into the oisias of dibur. But once you go down into machshava, then nismayat yoser. then it's undergone, the original rotzen has undergone a much bigger lessening or miud. She'ein harotzen rak b'koil v'dibur bilvad. The whole meaning from the rotzen is only now in his voice and in his speaking. She'ein hanika b'zeh oyer etzem harotzen v'lo yaseichel. But when you're talking out, it's not nika, the original power and toikiv of the rotzen, and afilu not the seichel, which was machalik the rotzen into different swaras. Even when you get into dibur, even that is not really recognizable. In other words, we can recognize that the person has a rotzen, or we can see that there's working here a rotzen, but he will say, I can't get into speech, everything I really thought, and I can't even get into speech, what was really in my dibur, when I started talking, I had in mind, but then I can't quite get that into as well known that there's what's called dibur shebamachshava, that you already start thinking in a way of prompting your talking, and then when you get talking you say, well, I can't quite get that out either, because even that's higher than the actual act of dibur. And so therefore he says, well, how much more so I can't really say in dibur everything I felt. So it means that in the dibur we see that there was a will, but we don't see all the elevation and the delicacy of the will, even how it was even how he broke it down somewhat in the Indian from Seichel. He just says, I want kach for kach, or I'd like kach for kach to be done. But, and this will cause me a lot of pleasure, and I'll be thankful if you will do this and this. But that doesn't reveal to me all the inyanim, how they were originally in the original hisoiras of the will, of the rotzen. Or another possibility, the first possibility we just discussed was that he's megala rotzono b'diba. In other words, he tells people what he really wants. Another possibility says that Rabbi Oi, Masha Rachel Adaba Bozeh, Yeshu Harotzen Shebadiba. Another possibility said that Rabbi is that a person who has a will and he wants something, then sometimes he just likes to talk about it. The etzem talking about it is a form of like a gishmak in the rotzen. And therefore you see, some people, when they got they have a sort of a real interest in a certain matter, or they have a koch in a certain Indian, and they like just to talk about it. There's almost like a form of a fulfillment in the etzem dibur. The etzem talking somewhere or another is a form of a milui harotzen. Not a complete milui harotzen, but it makes them feel good just to talk about the mila of this Indian. How they've put a lot of thought into it, and this is really a great Indian, etc., etc. In other words, that they like to talk about the etzem Indian of the rotzen, but they're not just saying, please do this and that. In other words, in the first possibility, the Rebbe was saying that he's megala the rotzen in dibur, so he says, here, you guys get moving, get this done for me, kach. In other words, he's more in a position where others will carry out the rotzen for him. So there he talks to him, and he tells him what he wants. Another possibility is that maybe he's not in such a situation, but he just likes to talk about the etzem thing that he wants. Talking about it is itself a certain gishmak. Therefore, talking about it brings a certain milu of the rotzen. There was a Rebbe he still likes to talk about it, but that's a rotzen more in the etzem dibur rather than in the etzem inyan of the rotzen.
What's the difference between seichel and machshava?
Oh, machshava is just a lavush. Seichel is one of the etzem koiches of the nefesh. Seichel is the etzem koich to be mavin. I feel believe he says. And machshava is just in that after you're already emotionally involved, and that touches off the lavush of machshava, which is easy. And then you start thinking about it. But the hina for machshava is only misharet what you felt, what you were emotionally involved. If you're not emotionally involved, you don't have machshava. You can't have a certain inyan of what's called machshavas seichel. Machshavas seichel, but that's really a a very delicate, it's really coral in the inyan from seichel. It's not so much inyan from machshava, the real thing. Emes machshava is the way that we see it. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Perikov. The inyan from machshava comes after the gilui of the seichel in the middles. In other words, machshava is only what we call a lavush. It's only a medium for bringing outwards into the realm of the zulas what you've thought and what you rather have been maskil and what you feel. And so you yourself are also the beginning of being the zulas. You yourself are the first step out towards the ultimate zulas. So the inyan of machshava is how you talk to yourself in oisias and in sentences what you understood in a much higher realm in the seichel. The inyan of machshava is only a lavush provide.
In some ways it seems that the midas are higher than the seichel. In some ways it seems that the midas are higher than the seichel.
No. The midas are not higher than the seichel. Where did we learn something that suggested that?
The ratzon is more manifested in the midas than the ratzon is in the seichel.
Well, to a certain extent you have a point. We mentioned that in the last class. That's probably what you're referring to. Yeah, to a certain extent you have a point. That the midas are really a gilui of the ratzon, according to the Alter Rebbe in Parsha Ba'aloischo, in the first Maimon, a famous passage over there in the first part of the first Maimon, what he says that really midas are a gilui of the ratzon. Zenachon. But that's if we talk about the inyan of midas aliyah mamish b'toikev in the inyan of the nefesh mitzad atzmai. There are midas. The nefesh got all the 10 koyches mitzad atzmai. Here we're talking about a higher koyach going through the different levels of all the different koyches of the nefesh. So then, normally the gilui goes through. First of all, he considers what he wants, and then he brings it into his emotion, then he brings it into his talk, machshava, then he brings it into diva. In other words, we go according to the hierarchy of the koyches. So then, the inyan from seichel has got a much greater mila over midas, because midas are the hergis of the feeling of the self, right? And there are inyan from hargosha are the metzias of world. In other words, the whole inyan from a midah comes with the fact that you are an individual connected with a feeling and an existing world. That's what a midah is. That's how you function. You function through the midas in making the world relate to you. Ilu seichel is where you're still considering the matter in all sorts of conceptual ways, and as we said, dividing into different swaras and different approaches and ways of seeing what would be the best way to reach it, and what to compromise somewhat, what to view as absolute, etc., etc. So the seichel is much higher in that regard. That's true. It's important that the midas ultimately have a very high shoresh, and in a way they have a higher shoresh than what the seichel is. The truth is, zenachon, and they have a shoresh in the pinimis of the ratzon. That's what the Alter Rebbe is marking. That's what he means. The etzem minyan of the midas eik shahem. Here we're talking how the Eivishter made a whole seder that the mensch relates one level of his koiches to the other, and that's how a mensch functions. He functions outside of normally, they call it in the proper way, in the way how it is al pi kedusha. The first of all, he's misboinen in India, and then he brings it down through the inyan with the seichel into the midas, and then into machshava, and then into that's the seder of the koiches, how they go. So the ratzon being in something which is outside the whole inyan, that's the way it goes. First of all, it goes through an interrelation of itself to the various factors in the seder, the gilui, the men. But in order to do that, it has to undergo a whole series of tzimtzumim. In the chanamit, there is a mara in the midas, and in a way, the midas atzmim, kamoi shahim, they are like a certain gilui of the seichel, more than the inyan from ratzon. I agree, but not in this whole seder of the functioning of the mensch in order to make his ratzon a practical thing in the world around him. Amamela said the Rebbe ad hamaisa. There it goes. First of all, either he just tells people in Dibba what he wants, or he just has a big tam and a big gishmak in talking about the inyan. Ad hamaisa shehu chitzayni yoisa. Until he comes down to the maisa where it's even more outward and more zvana. The koach hamaisa is only connected with the outer physical aspects of the body, and it's a physical levush which is shayat to doing things in the world mamish. She'ein ha'oras harotzen b'maisa rach la'aseis levad ve'ein loy aroich legile harotzen shebeseichel u'midah shebelei v'chein b'machshova. And here the Rebbe says a big chiddush. Later we're going to see that the ultimate maskana shakes this a bit, you understand? Because this is right, but ultimately there's another shleimus which comes when you bring your rotzen into mice. But he said when the actual rotzen going as it does through all the koiches comes into mice, then all it is a tremendous push to get things done b'poyo. So that when you're acting with a rotzen in mice, you're just doing things, albeit with a pressing teikif, that's the yin of the rotzen, but nobody really sees all the tremendous rotzen that there was in Seichel and all the deliberations that there were in the nefesh and all the understanding and the feelings which are prodding this whole activity on the part of the mensch. All we see is that he's very energetically carrying out a certain action which he wouldn't be doing if it hadn't been the istalsus of the rotzen through all of these koiches. When it comes into the actual ma'isa, all we see is a rotzen, and we see that from the energy and tuikif with which he does it, but it's only the inif and energy and a tuikif to do. This has got to get done. And therefore, if anybody comes along and say, come on, we've got this to do, let's get moving, this is going to be what's got to come out. And even in the inif machshava, machshava, as one known, is a very high levush, because it's a purely spiritual levush. Dibur is how we already get out into a form of physicality. When we get into dibur, we speak with the mouth, and there's a certain hevel, as is put down in many places, a hevel halev, like a hot air, which comes up and joins into the inif and dibur. All these inyonim are physical things. So therefore, dibur is like a middle point between machshava and Maisa. Machshava is a very high, and therefore machshava never ceases. Because of its high spiritual status, it's always miyuchat with the spirituality of the nefesh. And that was the Rebbe, when you get into Maisa, it's not nikah, the whole power that there was in the rotzen, how we entered the other koiches of the nefesh. V'im kein, ha'pnimi yoiser hu etem oyer harotzen shebetchilo v'achrov haseichel v'atam l'rotzen v'achitzoini b'seif hakoil v'yoiser hu harotzen shebemaisa sheboi nismayet oyroi betachlis. So the Rebbe said, let's sum it up. He says, the kumta is that the pnimi, the highest inner power of the nefesh, is in the original rotzen. Yeah, that began in the etzem ur of the rotzen. Now it started off at the beginning, and that's the word shebetchilo. V'achro, and after that, in status and in what you might call elevational status, you've got the inif and seichel and tam l'rotzen. Yeah, and chulu, and then we went down through the other derivations, and the most chitzoini, the most what you might call a surface expression of the whole inyan was in the end of the whole process, which was the sofa kuil b'yaisa, and that's the rotzen, how it came into maisa. Shaboy nismayet oyroi betatlis. There, the light of the rotzen is not nikah. All we see is a series of activities, albeit with a certain energy and with a certain point to them and a certain kavanah which is guided by the rotzen, but without oyer. All we see is the activity b'poyo. Of Amira we got then two extremities. Rak, says the Rebbe. However, liyos nasa b'maisa b'poyo mamish levad. So the word rak is a continuation. Shaboy nishmayet oyer betachlis. The oyer has been withdrawn ultimately. Only its whole business is that the maisa should be made b'poyo mamish levad. That is the only tachlis. But chilo meya hapnimi v'hoylech v'yoyred b'slav shoynois ad shabo el ha'maisa ha'chitoinius mikulon, or the chitoiniis mikulon. The highest form is the 8Tamuz itself, and it goes down through a whole series. It's Hoyle V'Yoyreid, B'Slabsha Shainis, through different enterings into different Levushim, At Shabor, until it comes El Maisa, which that is the outward and more surface of all of them. So in other words, we've given a picture of how a high and very pnimi is. And when we use the word pnimi, we mean gilui atzmi yoter. Because everything's got pnimis in the sense that it's got oil, it's got a kli, and it enters its kli. Therefore, everything that we're discussing here are to a certain extent koiches pnimiyim. Seichel, midas, all those in machshava, they're all koiches pnimiyim. What we mean by the word pnimi, we mean the milah of the gilui ha'atzmi of the nefesh yoter. So therefore it's called, the rotzen is called pnimi, and the maisa is called chitzoni. And it's like the chitzonius of the end of everything. And so everything began with a very high pnimi, which was the actual gilui of the rotzen, and it was hoyle v'yoyred through these different islapshus, and what each lower inner became like a lavush over the oil of the rotzen, until it comes to the maisa. Well, that is the chitzonius mi kula. That is the most surface or outward or lacking pnimius of all of them. Good, so that's how it is in the mashal by the Adam. V'cheinu b'seida ishtaushel l'mayla be'eses fileis min hakeser adam alchus. He said, so it is, if we take the inyan of the eses fileis l'mayla, then the inyan from keser elyain, or that's the inyan harot. So that's what he says, min hakeser ad hamalchus. The keser elyain, that abbreviation makes keser elyain. That's the inyan from keser. Hu b'chinas harot. Habo begilui letzerich aishtaushels. Obo bislapshes b'chinas chokma bina, shezo b'chinas aseichel v'tam l'rotzen. So Kaviyachol, the Eibishter, also reveals his will for the whole gilui, the creation of the world, which is going to take place through Spheres HaMalchus. So first of all, the Eibishter reveals his will. Now we're going to see that in the revelation of the Eibishter's will, there are also kama madregas, or kama levels of that gilui. So by the time we reach Keser Elyain, which Keser, albeit, is a makiv to the Eses Filas, but it's already the rotzen, how it's a makor, or at least a makor rochi suyam to all the spheres. In other words, a keser is like, particularly how it is in Arich, it's already like a mokir to the spheres, albeit it's moved al mihem, but it's in mokir korev to the spheres, like we see a chokhmah mi'ayin timotzei, that the chokhmah taka comes b'derech yesh mi'ayin from keser of a sochosov. It is a certain kiruv to all the spheres which are going to come from it. That's the inyan from keser. So therefore that indicates the inyan from rotzen, how rotzen's undergone a certain derivation, which we'll discuss here at a later point as we go on. It's undergone a certain gilui of the inyan rotzen. It's already revealed what it's wanting. And it's saying that it wants for the time eses files, and once it gets those eses files, it's going to reveal through them the ultimate tachlis, which is the kavanah in the hisavas yesh mi'ayin alidei malchet. And that was the Rebbe, the inyan from keser elyain. That's the inyan from rotzen habo b'gilui. That's the expression there that he uses. It's a rotzen which comes into revelation. And it's l'tzorech ha'ishtaushlos. He brings that will into rotzen because we need that in order to promote the whole inyan of the ishtaushlos. If there weren't the rotzen, then it wouldn't be the ishtaushlos. Albeit the ishtaushlos are already tzimtzumim l'gabi the rotzen. That's because the rotzen is always a superior koyach to that which comes out from it begolui. And that was the Rebbe, the inyan from keser is hisoyres of the rotzen begilui l'tzorech ha'ishtaushlos. Ubo b'islapshus b'chinas chokma ubina, and it comes into a state of islapshus, first of all in the two spheres of chokma ubina. Shezeu Pchinas Aseichel V'Tam L'Rotzen. That's Kaviyochel Lamaila, the Seichel V'Tam, how it is in the Esses Spheres, albeit that's not our way of understanding Seichel V'Tam. How you call it? Chochma Iloah is Antu Chachim V'Loi V'Chochma Yediyah. It's not our form of Chochma. Of Sof Kol Sof, it's a form of Chochma. And that's what the Rebbe said, that it's Bo B'Hi Slapshus, is also, that's a somewhat borrowed term. The Indian of Kesed doesn't really come be slapshus in Chochma. You do it. It doesn't really enter Chochma Bina if you do it. Where have they been up to? It doesn't really enter the Indian of Chochma Bina in a really slapshus. About Choponi, for our purposes, we can call it a Indian for slapshus. Shezeu Pchinas Aseichel V'Tam. Shebezeh Mischamtzem U'Mismayet Oyer HaKeser. Well, that's the first beginning of a tzimtzum and a miut in the Oyer of Keser. Ad shebe'efshor sheyislabesh b'Pchinas Chochma Ubina. In other words, the Keser being as it is still an unlimited Oyer, still a inyan of Oyer ain't safe. It's still an Indian of Rotzen in the real sense. For it to enter Chochma Bina, that it has to undergo Tzimtzumim. And so we can say that those two words, Mitzamtzem or Mismayet, are indicative of two different aspects in those Tzimtzumim. The Tzimtzum is more a dover which is just Magbil, but it's not so much Memayet in the real sense, because the word Memayet means to lessen or to hold back. You have to make less in a way. The Indian from Tzimtzum is more, like a limiting of the thing Kamoishahu. But we'll soon see a dogma of that as we go along here. It's like a limiting of the Indian, more like squeezing it into a certain smallness, as you might say. Of a miut is that we're really holding back and limiting its way of revealing itself. And that's the Indian of the Yerida of Keser into Chochma Ubina. So that undergo those tzimtzumim and miutim in order that it should be able to enter the derech levush, the Indian of Chochma Ubina. And like we've seen each time, the Rotzen enters a levush. So just like a mensch, when we talk about his slapshus, when you enter a levush, then albeit the levush becomes your Indian. When you enter, for example, when you put on your levushim, they're tailing to you, and they express you, they assist you, and they're bottled to your purpose. But yet on the other hand, they do limit you somewhat. There is a certain pa'ula of the levush on the Odom. He's not able to do all sorts of things which he could maybe do if it weren't for the fact that he'd been mislavish a levush. And the more what you might call delicate and developed the levush that you enter, the more it limits you. The more what you might call developed is the levush, then the more it limits you. For example, if you put on your, a good suit, then you can't go, make an athletic jump, and you can't swim in the pool, and or you can't even go, digging in your garden, or all sorts of things like that. There's a certain pu'ula of the levush on the mislabi. So that's the whole Indian that we see here, that the Rotzen undergoes a Yerida into Kaviochel Chochma Eloah, and then he said that causes in a certain Hakbolim. Chochma Bina Magbilim Esoya, or they cause a certain, like we just said, that the Levush has a limiting effect. Shabo Lakama is Chalchus Madrege, like we saw earlier in the Moshul, that the Indian of Seichel tends to break things into svaras and into reasonings, and therefore, and into different ways of looking at things. Similarly, Lamaila Kaviochel, there occur certain interdivisions within the Rotzen. It's no longer just a Oya Poshut, but it's already got certain aspects to it which are going to be avenued and guided by these different Nionim in Chochma Ubin, just like it is in the mensch himself. Over there, the Rebbe talks about this whole Indian of the Hagbola caused by Chochma Bina in a Indian Shal Rotzen. Umi chokma bina lemidas. Yeah, that through having gone, the Rotzen goes through the Indian from chokma bina, and then it enters the Indian from midas shebazor. What Zohar is the Indian from Zai Anpin, that's the name of the midas. That's the Kabbalah name for the midas Adayar and Atzilas. Yeah, he said, and then after the entry into Zohar, into the midas, umachshova elyoino, ibchinas alavush elamidas u moichin. Now, a little bit later on, well, I don't know if in this Maimah, but in the Hemshik there is discussions. Maybe we'll mention it in another couple of lines here. That there's of course a difference between the Lavush of Machshova and the Lavush of Diba. As we saw, Lavush of Machshova, a very elevated and spiritual Inyan, which doesn't really bring anything, at least by the Odom, into the world of Poyal yet. Mashing Diba does. Diba's a Yerida into a more Magushim Dika state, and it brings closer to the Inyan of Maisa. So similarly, we'll see that Lamaila in Malchus, which is the Inyan of Olam HaOisias and Olam HaDibur, then there are these Inyanim of two main levels. That's like the Inyan of Pnimis HaMalchus and Chitzonius HaMalchus. That Malchus is the great Lavush of the Oisias over all the other spheres, and it has in itself Machshova and Dibur. And so the Machshava Elyoina is the Lavush to the Midas and the Moichin. Umizo Yered Harotzen Umislavish Bepinas Malchus Shupinas Dibur Elyoin. In other words, when we say Malchus, we mean Malchus in the sense of Chitzonius HaMalchus. Malchus are already Shayat to bring out all the Inyonim into Biyah. And Shupinas Dibur Elyoin. Bepinas Maisa. Yeah, the Dibure shall Kodesh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. My mashon is Bu'aliyil Dibur Maskov Yedaber Bamidbar Sinai. That's Pasha Bamidbar. Quite a few Maimonim back here in the Hemshah. Mamileh says the Rebbe that from the Inyan of once the Inyan has been mislavish in Malchus, but that's the Inyan from Dibur, then the Inyan of Maisa follows automatically. In other words, once something's entered the Eibishter's speech, then automatically it becomes Maisa. And that's what he says. The Dibure shall HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. What does he mean with that? What is the reference to that Maimah over there in Bamidbar Sinai? It's one on it's put down in Divrei HaMedrashim and particularly the Zohar Kodesh. It's put down that Machshavte shall HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. That the Eibishter's Machshava is just like Maisa. And there's also a certain implication, one or two of those Maimorei Chazal, that Dibur shall HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. That the Eibishter's Dibur is Choshiv Maisa. Now, what does it mean with that? What is the Chiddush? What kilo was the important concept that we're being taught by saying once it reaches the Olam HaDibur or the Eibishter, then that already becomes Maisa. There's no, as it were, first of all Machshava and then Dibur, and then the Eibishter says, oh yes, now I'm speaking about this, maybe I'll do it. In other words, there's no Hevdel in the Lavushim of the Eibishter. Once you get to Lavush Machshava or Dibur, then you've already got Maisa. Machshavte shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. Dibure shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshiv Maisa. Bir Hadover is that we see by a mensch all of his inyonim, even the koiches of the nefesh, and especially, well, when I say even, maybe it's not such a big chiddush, the koiches of the nefesh and the lavushim, all of them, and what he would like to achieve through them, are like two different stages altogether, and there has to be a big siyata d'shmaya that one should lead to the adya. As the famous expression Hayom Yom has it, and it's brought down the famous quip by the Chassidim, as von Trachten wird noch nicht gar nicht. just from thinking, nothing happens in the meantime. And some people say, no, Eret Shane, he talks very beautifully, but where's the poil man? So we see that you can think a tremendous amount and you can talk a tremendous amount. Lavdavki that anything's going to happen. Ma'aseh is a whole big further step, and on the contrary, it's a very deliberate step and a very effort demanding step. You've got to really make a lot of effort to get things into Ma'aseh. So if we take the koishes and the chesed, you can be a big bal chesed. And he said, yours, I really love the briyos, I really like helping people, and I really mean tremendously well, and this and that. That's right. You're a Gaval Chesed, you really love everybody, and you really intend helping them, and he, love Davki, that it comes into action. I'll say this by a means. Lamaila, it's not like that. Lamaila, Chonila B'chas, to say that if the Eibishter Kaviyachol feels something, that means that he's either going to work out whether anything's going to happen or whether not. So even in the Indian of the midas of the Eibishter, this is true. Not just in Machshava and in Dibur, but even in the midas of the Eibishter. And that was brought down, the famous beer in the Lashon, Machalkel Chayim B'Chesed. That the Eibishter, through his midas HaChesed, he already gives you all the Chayim. Machalkel means to feed the Chayim. The Eibishter's Chesed, that itself is the Chayim. In other words, like he writes in Shara Yichud, we just learned in Perek Dalet, the Alter Rebbe Masbo, the Barichas, that from the Chesed of a Kodesh Baruch Hu, that's a Chayim of Kol Olam Eskulam. For them, what Nimshuk, the Chayim, the Ribu Yoyim, the Sadein Shir, the Etzem Chesed itself does it the Chayim. Not the first of all, the Eivshter loves all the Bria, and he loves the Nivroim, and then he gives them something. So the reason why we say, we say, why is it that the Ikea seems to, in our sages, seems to center around the two Inyonim, Machshava and Dibur? Because when the Eibishter's Machshava becomes Ma'aseh, then there undergoes a Shinui Otzum in the situation, how it is in the Machshava of the Eibishter, and what actually happened. The Hainu, his Machshava causes a Hishavus. It causes a creation, B'derech Yesh Me, Ayin. And the whole meaning of the difference between Machshava and Dibur is in what sort of Hishavus. In other words, that the Hishavus, like he brings down in Shara Yichud Atzmai, that the Hishavus that comes from the Eibishter's Machshava, the Eilamas Elyonim, you say, how do you call it, the Eilamas Haruchnim Nailim B'Yosim, or Eilam HaBriya, and Eilam HaYitzira. They come about Mitadina from Machshavti. The Inyan from Dibura is a further step. But immediately the Eibishter says, that something is created from it, but it's a much greater difference between the os and what actually comes about. In other words, that from a divine Kaviyachol, hashpah called a os, there comes about a new Matthias called a Shabbos Yesh Me Ayin, until we come down into the Shabbos of Olam Hazeh and the Olam HaGashmi. But that's the union of Yesh Me Ayin B'Poyo. That's the union for Dibur. Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'Poyo. But what the Maimon Chazal means to say is that happens immediately, and not only immediately, the giving forth of the os, means that it's going to bring about a new Mashiach. And that's the union of Dibur Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshim. And for that matter, so what's the difference between Chesed and Dibur, or Chesed and Machshava? The difference is that Chesed always remains a spiritual, divine type of Ashpah. It remains Chayes. Chayes is a spiritual, divine Indian of the Eibishter. It's the Chayes of the keys. When the Eibishter talks, he makes all these things until he makes a T. But that's a Matthias. Nifredas Kaviyachol. Me Mia koiches that bring it about, but it's automatic. It just me'achashu medaber, they call it. And then afterwards there's a chayes elokis hamislavish b'zeh. What does it mean? Of ein ochanami chashti shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu gam chodesh mayis. You know, it's really a very simple. The whole thing is a very simple inyan. By a mensch, we see that his machshava and his ma'isa and his midas, don't mean anything practical at the moment. I mean, he will never get to practice if he doesn't have them. But not necessarily do they automatically mean that that's it. But the Eibishter immediately has a midas hachesed. Immediately there's hashpah ein soif, comes about from that. And the same with Inyan van Tibur, and the same with Inyan van Machshava. The Chiddush beam, why do I say distress and Machshavte, but Dibure, that's a much bigger Chiddush. The Adam knows by himself how distant it is from Machshava Biz Ma'ase, and the Lamaila, it's a tremendous Chiddush, because there is already a Shinui in the Mahus HaDvarim. There comes about a Dova HaNivdal Mea Dibur, or a Filu Mea Machshava. A Dova HaNivdal, and that's the Inyan of the Levushima, Achitoinim Yoyis. There was the Rebbe does the pshat that Machshavti shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshev Ma'is, Diburi shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Choshev Ma'is. And that's what he's meant with that Maim over there, V'yitaber B'midbar Sinai. The Besedi Ishtaushel Hazeh, Yoyred Oer Ein Seif, Mimadrege L'madrege, Mikesel L'chochma, Michochma, V'chuleve, he goes down into Bina and into Midas, and eventually he comes into the Inyan of the Lavushim, which are the Inyan from Pnimis HaMalchus, the Tachis, the Yoishis, Elyoinim, when they bring the Oilamas Elyoinim, and then the Inyan of Dibur, what that brings about Mamish, the Dova HaNifrat Bapoyo. Akamesh Kosu be 8Chaim, and now he brings a Dugma, let's say. Now this is not necessarily talking in this Dugma, Mamish about the Inyan from Rotzen B'miyuchad. This is talking about the Gilui of Oyer Ein Seif. Well, Ein Achanami, the Inyan from Gilui Ein Seif doesn't occur unless there's a Rotzen anyway. But the 8Chaim at this point is not being Mishyachas Mamish to the Inyan Rotzen. It's just talking about the Gilui of the Eibush Zohar, how it undergoes a series of Yeridus and derivations. So the Rebbe is borrowing on that to show you that that's the way all Inyanim that they start off in the Ein Seif, they all go through this whole Inyan from Yerida. And once that's been established, then everything literally has to go through that. So therefore he brings down the famous lashon of the 8Chaim, Akamesh Kos 8Chaim, the Oyer Ein Seif Meir Bekeser U'Bechachma Bekiruv Makeh. It's well known. There's a famous statement in the 8Chaim. This is brought in many drushim. So there's the Oyer Ein Seif Meir Bechachma U'Babina. Sometimes it's written. Bekeser, Bechachma, Babina, Bekiruv, Makom, Bezo, Derech Haloin, or B'malchus, Derech Neikev. The Oyer Ein Seif is Meir, Chachma, Babina, Bekiruv, Makom. Now, come on, there's no Makom no either. So why do we use that expression, Kiruv, Makom? Well, that will switch in a second. In other words, the Oyer Ein Seif is still near to Keser, Chachma, and even Afila Bina. Oh, but once it goes down into Zohar, into Midas, then the Oyer Ein Seif is literally gone through a window. In other words, a window lets in light, but it doesn't let in light everywhere. It only lets it in a certain limited way. In other words, that the light can't just be meir all over the house. It only comes in as much as the window permits it to come in. And from Malchus, the Oyer goes to Neikev. Neikev means a hole. So there's a very small appearance of the Oyer Ein Seif Kaviocho in the Inyan of Malchus. It's only through literally a hole. Well, a hole lets through a lot less. Now, here we're going to pay attention, so we'll read a couple of words further. So the Rebbe says, B'chokma b'kiru mokim, Ovavada yesh chiluk bein oifen hagilui b'keser lahagilui b'chokma. So what are you doing by saying, putting them all in one little, you put them in one group, and you say that the Oyer Ein Seif is meir b'keser b'chokma b'kiruv makom. So the Rebbe said, wait a minute, why'd you put Keser and Chochmah together? There's a zikr that there's a difference between the way of the Gilui, how it is in Keser, and the Gilui by Chochmah. Sof Perik Beis, the Bekeser Meir, Bekiru, Ubiharchova, Uba'aba Va'emo, which means Chochmah Ubina, Bekiruv Beloy Harchova. So here the 8 himself puts it right. In other words, our Maimon that we're quoting from the 8 is just talking about the Klolis Inyan of the word Kiruv. What Kiruv means nearness and not distance. But that's for sure that the way the Erin Seif relates to Keser and his Meir, and that is much more than in Chochmah. It's just that for our purposes that we're quoting here, generally it's Bekiruv Makom in both Inyonim, just that Vadai in Keser it's more Harchova meaning with breadth of its own self, and in Chochmah it's already without the Harchova. Why? Because in Chochmah we already get to Nakuda, we already get to a form of a tzimtzum of the Etzem Hagilui in the form of a Nakuda. But both of them are Klolius Bekiruv Makom. Bekiruv Makom. In other words, why do we put in here the word Makom? I mean, there's no Mokim up there. I mean, I feel there's no any implication of any Mokim. Well, whether the Pshat Kiruv Makom, that we see that when you take something near to you and you say, this is my Mokim, this is near to me and it's together with me in my Mokim, then literally whatever you experience, at least B'Klolis Hagilu, whoever's with you, he also gets the same inyan. Therefore, we can suggest that what he means to say that the early Seif is Meir, Bekiruv Makom, but there could be the differences in the Etzem Mishkalas. Let's say that something was Meir to both of us who are standing in one. It could be that I'm much more of or somebody else is a much more of an understander and appreciator of that which has come. But Klolius, it's therefore for both of us, because we're both in the same nearness, we're both found together. And that's what we call Bekiruv Makom. And that's what he points out in the bracket. That expression, Kiruv Makom, doesn't mean that each one gets it in exactly the same way, but they get a Klolius in the same way. In other words, that the Kiruv is here as an Inyan Kloli. It's not an Inyan which means the details of every Kabbalah on the part of the Maccabim. Ubabina Berichuk Moche. And in Bina it's already Berichuk Moche. Ubi Chaim Isa, it's mashme in another place in the 8 Chaim. The Gam Babina Bekiruv. It's written in the Lashon Bekeser Bechokma Ubabina Bekiruv. Okay. He said Mavua B'Moki Macher HaTeirotzo. It's explained in another place the Teirotz on that Kashia. In other words, in one place in the 8 Chaim it's mashma that the Kiruv Makom with which the Erin Seif is Meir is only in Keser and Chochmah, but not in Bina, and on the contrary, in Bina it's already Berichuk. He said in another place it's mashma that Bina is also in the Kiruv. So he says, V'atirotzo zeh mavua b'mokim acher. So here's where it becomes tantalizing. That the Teretz is written in another place. So if I sent somebody down the night to get me that booklet and he came back empty-handed, so I don't know who's to blame. Either he's to blame or the shop is to blame, but anyway, there's no booklet. When I send somebody to buy me a saver and he comes back empty-handed, that's hard for me to come to terms with. Anyway, is Bamela. We would have just looked it up in the footnotes, and some guy who was being paid to work on this whole deal, he would have found it. He would have looked up in the computer all the different places, and he would have found where the tenants. He would have written it down. Here we're going to break our heads to work out where's the tenants of Zakashia. So it seems to me that in a place in Iron Base, the Rebbe that I remember seeing, the Rebbe over there doesn't necessarily say this is his beer on this particular Kashia. But when we clear there, we can understand what's the beer over there. And Amir Hashem, I'll talk about that more in future and coming episodes, because it's a little bit of an ariches. And Aleph, I'm running out of questions, and zweitens, I've got a meeting in another few minutes. So we'll just complete the Lashon. Umibina lazor derech haloin, from Bina to Zor by way of a window. Umizor lamalches derech nekev, and from Zor down into Malchus through a hole. V'hakol kai alam shocha v'gili de erein seif shemismayet mimadrega lamadrega kamesh gazim mokim acher. So here we see this is like a dogma that we've taken from the closest union of the Gila of the Ein Seif, Lefiha, it's written in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, is the Eifen HaGila. We're not necessarily talking only about the Union from Rotzen, but also the Union from Gila Ein Seif, when it enters the sphere as it goes, Bo'efen Koch, Kazeh, that Keser and Chochma, Kiro, Bina is Richel, or sometimes Bina is also Kiro, Malch is Nekev, Zoh is Chaloin, etc., etc. So when you think about that carefully, you become Mesaira with a Shiloh which is Deirish, a little bit of beer, and God willing we'll talk about that in the coming episode as well. And that is that if something goes, the Kiruv Makol, and it goes more or less as it is, and that's what we want to say, that the Eir is made with the whole Shleimas in Keser and even in Chochmah. Why is that Barachov and that not? We'll see. It depends on the ability of the Makabel to, like we said, sometimes it can be different. Two people can be mamish in one union, but they're not necessarily taking it mamish the same. The whole union from the Kiruv and or the difference between Bina and Chochmah, how they're Makabel from the Kiruv, that's going to be Mitzidam more than Mitzat the Ritzay. But actually, the Indian, if you say something goes through a chalon or something goes through a nekev, then ultimately that's the same thing. It's like being limited from the sides almost. But the same Indian is ma'ir, and the same thing through a nekev. All you've done is you've cut the ability of that oil to go through. But so it's really the same. It's really the same oil. So why do we bring it here as a dogma, the Indian from Mismai? So we're going to have to be misboinen in that, albeit this is a lesson which occurs in many places in this, but again, in order to understand it correctly, we're going to have to be misboinen a little bit, and I leave that to the fruitful thoughts of the readers in coming future days. But that's the Indian fun. What he goes on to say, when it comes to our Indian, but there are clouds in the Rotzen HaGolui, we're talking only here about the Rotzen HaGolui already, Keser, Upchinas Tehiru Tatua, the lower brightness, Tehiro Tatua, Sha'acha HaTzimtum, the Ein Upchinas Machshava Kaduma Diak, Shezehu Upchinas Tchilas Aiseros Rotzen Begila Ala Ilamas, Obom Mimadrega Lamadrega, Akudim, Nakudim, Chulu. What everybody knows that Akudim, Nikudim, and Brudim are referring to Olam Akudim, Olam Atoihu, and Olam Hatikun, Olam Hatikun. Good. So we'll deal about that more in future and coming and developing episodes. It's all we can say is that we pray that Be'ez Hashem everything should be Atzlacha Gedola, and everything should take with miyad, should be Tishkalas of Melech HaMashiach, and the Gila for the Ein Seif, without Chaloin, without Nekev, without all the Dinyanim, no Gila, Shleimus Ein Seif, Lamata Mata, well